Thank you all for joining Skystone Partners today in On Giving, Incisive Commentary and Analysis at the Intersection of Philanthropy and the Greater Good. I'm Liz Newpel, President and CEO of Skystone Partners, where we believe philanthropy is a powerful force for good. I'm proud to welcome our guest, Beth Breeze. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Beth.
One of the world's most prominent researchers, professors, and speakers on philanthropy, what causes people to give, and what makes a fantastic fundraiser. Beth is the director of the Center for Philanthropy and reader in social policy at the University of Kent. Among Beth's publications, of course, we'll be talking about On Giving today, in Defense of Philanthropy today. But among her publications is The New Fundraisers, Who Organizes Charitable Giving in Contemporary Society, which is the first empirically grounded and theorized account of the identity, characteristics, and motivation of fundraisers, and is also the 2017 AFP Skystone Partners Prize for Research winning book. She also writes and speaks extensively on a number of topics, including most notably In Defense of Philanthropy, the topic of our conversation today, and The Logic of Charity. Today, we'll talk about her research in her new book, In Defense of Philanthropy, which was just released 2 weeks ago. And I have an electronic format, which is why we just have the paper here today, on September 30th. So before we begin our conversation, there's just a couple of housekeeping items to keep things rolling smoothly. First, about format. We'll have some discussion with Beth about her research and findings. Then we'll have a few minutes for select questions from you before we wrap up our conversation. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And the chat feature where you said hello earlier in the hour has been turned off. So please go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Our question moderator today is one of our senior members of the Skystone Partners team, Bill Mulvihill, and he'll receive your questions. He will be curating a number of them, so Beth has the opportunity to answer as many as we can without duplications. Bill is behind the scenes for right now, but he'll join us for our Q&A session. All right, down to business. Today we'll discuss philanthropy, its defense, and why giving and givers need our support. Of course, we have Beth to discuss her work on the question on everyone's mind: does philanthropy need a defense? Why and now? And how do we as donors, nonprofit executives, and volunteers respond in support of giving and those who give? Beth, it's so good of you to be here today, especially during this very busy time around the release of this new and important research. So shall we begin with a little bit of level setting today? One of the things that I'm curious about, because I think everybody defines this a little bit differently, is when you did your research in this book, how were you defining philanthropists? Who are we talking about?
Thanks very much, Liz, and hi to everybody who's joined us. I recognise a couple of the names. There's a couple of academics there. We've all missed seeing each other in person for the last year or so. So this is wonderful to still be able to connect. So thank you for giving us a chance to connect and giving me the chance to talk about this book. Great first question, because we have to know what it is we're talking about when philanthropy is being either attacked or defended. So the simple answer, straightforward answer, is that we're all philanthropists. The word only means love of humankind. So everybody is capable of love of humankind, and pretty much everybody demonstrates that some of the time, if not, most of the time. But there's a slippage, isn't there, between what the word actually means and how it's used in practice. And in practice, it does tend to be used rather more exclusively, more of an elite word for the biggest givers, perhaps for the most well-known givers, perhaps just for those who have the highest public profile. So there's already a slippage from what the word actually means to how it's used in these kind of conversations. And they're the kind of issues that I was trying to get at in the book, that we make the mistake of generalizing from very specific concerns and questions and then tarring all of philanthropy with the same brush. So, for example, some of the recent critiques of philanthropy, I think, really are only about a very small niche group of very large donors, perhaps based in the US, perhaps giving in a certain style, like through an endowed foundation. But the word philanthropy is used as if it applies to all kinds of givers. So I think we need to be really careful in our language in all of these conversations, because if we say philanthropy is problematic, or all philanthropy is power, or philanthropy is a scam, or philanthropy is in an elite charade, we've not defined it. We've not said, oh, I just mean these kind of philanthropists, just the ones who do it in this way. We're using the word generally. So of course, as I say, it then tars everybody. So I think it should mean all people who give time, money, talent, expertise, whatever. But I think we need to be realistic that people have in mind, they've got Bill Gates in their mind when they're talking about philanthropy.
Right. Or Mackenzie Scott. So philanthropy, as you see it, is a much broader, much greater thing than what we're talking about in our very focused conversation today. Yeah. And so that, dear listeners, dear participants, today is who we're talking about when we talk about philanthropists. So the other thing that caught my attention, and this was early on in the book, and I was so pleased that you put it there to really give us some additional, criteria to think about, which is the book. There's a section in the book that addresses specifically the context of philanthropy and philanthropists, of time and place. And it fascinated me that there are documented criticisms that go back more than 300 years. So can you tell us a little bit about, what do time and place mean? What's the societal context mean as it relates to those who give?
Sure. So philanthropy is found in every historic era, and it's found all across the globe. So it's very omnipresent. And what I found interesting when I did the research for this book is that criticism of philanthropy is also found, everywhere and in all times. And one of the arguments that the critics make is that that until now, philanthropy has always been celebrated. In fact, it's been over-celebrated. No one has ever noticed before, say the critics, the problems, which are real, by the way. And just to be totally upfront, a defence of philanthropy is not a defence of every philanthropist and every philanthropist act. It's saying that in general, philanthropy has the potential to do good. But one of the points that the critics tend to make is, look, I've just noticed there's a problem, and we all need to notice, and we all need to stop celebrating, cancel the ticker tape parade, and get real here and stop cheering. And so, I have a chapter called, Is Philanthropy Under Attack? And I think the oldest documented example I have, and I'd love it if people could find something older, comes from 1545. When the kind of the mockery of the self-serving interests of the rich is pretty much around their desire for salvation. So philanthropy is a ticket, fast track to paradise. So they thought themselves halfway to heaven for giving away a coat, that kind of thing. Then you get during the Victorian period, when the golden age of philanthropy, so-called, lots of criticisms of philanthropists for being patronising, for being out of touch, for being sort of social climbing. They're only doing it so they can hang out with the king or queen or this bishop or that earl. And also philanthropy as a tool to quell social unrest, which again, modern critics tend to think that this is something new, but it was always the case. If we just placate the populace with some public baths and some entertainment, then they'll keep quiet and not sort of complain. And then into the 20th century, we have the earliest sort of what's called the fathers of modern philanthropy, Carnegie and Rockefeller. No celebration, no great applause when they tried to set up their foundations, but not given congressional approval, told that they're a menace to the welfare of the nation, and so it continues. So the point is, there's always been criticism. We can talk maybe later about why I think hypercriticism has recently developed and why it's landed so successfully. But I think it's important to remember that across time and across place, we always have philanthropy, and we always have people worrying about philanthropy.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm actually gonna push that conversation forward a little bit, because I think it does immediately beg, if this is true, and if it has happened over time, why is it that it appears that in today's society, people are saying, oh, look, I've just noticed this. Why is it happening more so today?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of factors. One is we just got a cluster of books coming out around the same time, which gained a big audience, and were then followed up with quite lots of social media noise. You didn't used to get that. You could even lots of grandstanding on social media. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that push factor. It was also the lack of any pushback. And I suppose that's really what prompted me to write the book. We all heard these speakers, we read these books and thought, fair point, quite often. but there's another side to this. And then we all kind of sat patiently waiting for the other side, or I certainly did, or sat in the pub with my friends thinking, so someone's going to say in a minute that not all philanthropists are egotistical idiots, and someone's going to say in a minute that it's not just a tax dodge. And then kind of the years moved on and the critics carried on saying what they were saying, and we all carried on sitting in the pub saying it's not quite true. So I think that's what's happened, really, that it just all got a bit one-sided for a while.
So it was time to take a stand. And with all of this in mind, with social media, with a lot of books coming out, a lot of conversation and follow-up, with this in mind, there are so many big donors that are wealthy, powerful, successful business people and entrepreneurs. And I think you may have answered this, but one would imagine, and part of the argument against philanthropy is that it's a power grab and that it's undemocratic. So if these wealthy, powerful people are giving large gifts, mega gifts, why can't they defend themselves? Why do they need a defense? And how can we help make that argument?
Yeah. So I suppose I'm quite keen to be clear that I don't think they need me to put a defence for them. And I don't think they have particularly thin skins. I think if they did, we'd have heard something sooner. I think they're aware of their privilege and their position. And, it's probably just part of the course. So this defence is not, one of my great fears was that it would come across as a bit of an apologist for the rich. That's not the goal. Philanthropy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Philanthropy funds things, and it usually funds non-profit organisations. Sometimes donors set up their own activities, but fundamentally it's the funding mechanism for non-profit activity. And that non-profit activity is staffed by people who I think are on the call now. And of course it assists beneficiaries, which can sometimes be all of us, if it's environmental or if it's communities, and sometimes it can be the most vulnerable in our communities. So the reason for having a defence of philanthropy is not so much for the donor's benefit, but to make life hopefully a little easier for the people who are trying to mediate and facilitate and encourage philanthropy. And it's hard to encourage something if its reputation is being attacked from all quarters. But most crucially of all is to make sure that the flow of money carries on for the beneficiaries, because I think they are the potential most unintended consequences of allowing this criticism to continue without any pushback. Because if the money's not there to fund, vaccines and healthcare and education and scholarships and whatever else is needed, that's where the concern comes in. So the defence is for the beneficiary end and for the non-profit sector.
Absolutely. Okay, that makes good sense. And so I am curious about, and I think you've mentioned, what is the danger of a strong public critique of philanthropy and those who give? And I think we've hit on that, but following that up, you've mentioned the beneficiaries. It's not necessarily a defense of the philanthropists themselves, but I think it brings it to this issue of, and you'll be more eloquent than I, taxes. How does philanthropy work in the context of the state and the market? Because one of the arguments we hear is, why don't we just charge more taxes? Why don't people how does that work? How does philanthropy leverage for the greater good?
Yeah, thank you. And of course, in Europe, our enthusiasm for tax and for the state is higher than yours. So of course, I hear that argument even more here. And I am very happy to put on record that I am a big fan of higher taxes and a progressive welfare state and a generous social security net. Absolutely. The problem is when we put these two things up as opposites, as mutually exclusive counter arguments. So I think one of the reasons, going back to an early question, that people don't defend philanthropy is because it almost sounds, if you say you're in favour of philanthropy, that therefore you're against tax and you're against the state, and you think somehow private donors can run things. They can't, they don't want to, that's never been the case. But there's an assumption there that by saying anything positive about philanthropy, you're therefore saying something negative about the public sector. Of course, in reality, all three sectors have a unique and important role. They more often than not collaborate. They work together. Many private donors work with international governmental organisations as well as national and local governmental organisations. So it's a false opposition is the shorthand way of saying it. But I think that is one of the problems with these critiques, that you immediately sort of place yourself as some sort of ultra uber right wing person who doesn't believe there's a role for the state, which couldn't be further the truth for myself, and certainly for many of the rich donors that I've interviewed over the years. They come from every point on the political spectrum. Some of them have famously called for higher taxes. They've certainly called for clampdowns on tax avoidance. You can be in favour of a thriving progressive philanthropic sector and also be in favour of a stronger social system.
Right. And, one of the things that I really appreciated was the example in your book that shows very well how the state and philanthropy work together. And it was the philanthropist who had the idea of how to solve so many fatal automobile accidents that happened in the evening. And I'd like just if you could give us a thumbnail sketch of this example, and then we can talk about the different types of critique and how to respond to them.
Sure. So that comes when I'm talking about this accusation that philanthropists there's a slippage to plutocracy, that really if we keep on encouraging philanthropy and if we don't quash it and criticize it, we're going to end up with the rule of the wealthy, so plutocracy. So instead of elected officials, instead of the most talented public servants, it'll be those with the biggest bank accounts who just want to run schools and run hospitals and so on. Now, as I say, there's no evidence at all that the figures add up. You can't, even the most generous philanthropists in the world, or even if they use their whole wealth, they couldn't run education or health in a small state for longer than about a year. So it doesn't actually make sense to suggest that they want to replace government. Bill Gates is on record of saying, that we don't want to replace government. So people have been pretty clear about it. But yeah, some examples do help. So John Doerr was a scientist who was worried about the number of road crashes that happen, particularly at night. And he was the one who came up with the idea of shoulder striping, so having the white line along the side of the road. But when you have an idea, government doesn't suddenly take on your idea and do it. They've got other things to do. So his foundation, the Doerr Family Foundation, funded the shoulder striping, which was pretty expensive in those days, and were able to demonstrate and show that it did reduce the number of casualties. So over time, it doesn't happen immediately. That idea shifted from being a philanthropic innovation that was funded by private resources to become a completely mainstream thing that departments of transport do, the world over. The Doerr family did not want to carry on funding it and doing it. We don't expect the descendants of Doerr, the great-great-grandsons, to be, the superintendent for road striping, any more than a modern-day philanthropist who has an idea to improve education or health or whatever it might be, that they should somehow want to do it forever, fund it forever, and keep it in the family. So it's a response to this idea, which I think is basically just a misplaced assumption on the part of critics, that donors want to run things. They don't want to run things. They want to come up with new ideas that they can point to and say, I did that. I had a great idea, and that's part of my legacy.
Right. So basically, they're nimble. If they can get one person to listen, for example, I see a problem, road crashes at night. I think I might have a solution to this. Let's give it a try and I'll pay for it. That can be a very attractive option for someone who also sees the same problem. And if it proves to be effective, can, as you say, be something that becomes mainstream and the donor is grateful to have made a difference and reduced the number of automobile crashes, and then moves on about their merry way to see how else they may be able to leverage social change. That's pretty much
That's
it,
exactly
right?
it. I mean, some people have called it the innovation function. Some people have called it being society's risk capital. But what it comes down to is you have the idea, but you don't have the resources or the capacity to provide it forever.
Right.
So because, as I say, however wealthy you are now, you're not going to be able to, your wealth is episodic, your life is episodic. It's only the state has a capacity to take things to scale forever,
For sure.
because those needs are enduring.
For sure.
I think if we could get that across, that some of the academic concerns about philanthropy might be at least debated, because I think that fear of philanthropists wanting to take over the functions of government lies behind a lot of the academic critique.
Right. And so you mentioned the academic critique, and I think as we move into discussing the different types of critique, we'll also talk about the different types of arguments for and against. And you mentioned the academic critique. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the different ways are that people come to this with their point of view? What's their point of view?
Sure. So the academic critique would be concerns around democracy, accountability, power. That concern that rich people, they've not been elected. Who gave them the right to decide what's funded? And that's fair enough. That's true. And this concern that if we let it roll, as I say, that somehow it will want to take over the powers of government. There's a few responses to that. One I've already sort of set out that's not the philanthropic goal. The other part of the academic critique is the role of tax breaks. So not only is this a big power grab, but it's a state subsidised power grab, that we're all paying for, because that money would have otherwise been available for general spending.
Sure.
So my response to that is to say there are many things that government incentivises. Building my personal retirement pension pot, buying a house, childcare, setting up a business, health insurance. There are many things that you get a tax break on. The total cost of tax breaks in the UK is about 400 billion. I think in the US last time I looked, about 1.3 trillion. The total cost of charity tax breaks is the tiniest fraction of that. It's 2 billion in the UK, so 0.5%. So yes, it's true that you get a bit of government funding to help you, incentivize your philanthropic spending, but we also get the same kind of incentives to incentivize us to do lots of things where there's a purely private benefit. And I just find it interesting that there's not lots of books being written and hands being wrung over the fact that there's an undemocratic and state subsidized boost for my pension, but there is if I choose to donate to the Donkey Sanctuary or to my university or what have you. I think it's that's when I start to question, well, where are these criticisms coming from? What's actually going on here? Because it's not a unique feature of philanthropy that there's some government funding used for it. Similarly, the power question, it's true, these people are not elected, but nor are many people who have power. Business leaders, trade unionists, community activists, celebrities, in the UK, the royal family, all kinds of people have a platform and they use it for better or for worse. So again, there's this question of why philanthropists? Why are we uniquely worried about them rather than all those other unelected people who have some form of power or influence? And again, my starting point would be the goal at least is that they're trying to use that platform for good if they're doing philanthropy, always bearing in mind that the good is subjective. So that's where the academic critique's coming from. The final part of it, just worth maybe mentioning, is that other scholars than myself, people like Bruce Stevens at Stanford, have pointed out the paradox of philanthropy, that actually it can help encourage democracy. Yes, of course, it's undemocratic in the straightforward sense that these people are not elected, but it can encourage democracy by building civic strength, communities bringing people together, helping people, collaborate who they wouldn't know each other otherwise. A long and strong tradition of improving democracy, extending the vote to women, opening up institutions that perhaps were closed to all kinds of people. So there's a paradox in philanthropy that you can see it as a challenge to democracy, but also in many ways it strengthens democracy.
Sure, absolutely. And there are a couple of other different kinds of critiques of philanthropy that I noted in the book. The academic one, which is basically, how are we giving, right? Is that right? It's the questions about how are we giving? And then there's the insider, the philanthropist, the people working on the inside of the industry itself. In other words, what are we giving to? Is the challenge there. And then the populist argument against philanthropy. And I wonder if you might talk, which is why are people giving? So I'm curious if you might talk a little bit about each one of those, the insider argument or the insider critique, as well as the general populist critique, and how one might think about those arguments a little bit differently.
Sure, thanks. So my starting point is that there's a whole lot of noise about philanthropy. Philanthropy just seems to be getting a bad rap. It's problematic, and I wanted to disentangle, because I think there is a huge difference between a piece of scholarly, useful critique about the democratic aspects of philanthropy and a populist who just says, oh, they're just an idiot, or they're badly dressed, they've got big ears, they had a bad divorce, they're not a nice person, that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important that we don't, just as I asked them not to generalize about philanthropy, I don't want to generalize about the critiques. However, having all these three together means they kind of mutually feed off each other. It just, I think, creates the undermining of the reputation of philanthropy that is problematic. But yeah, the other two, more briefly than the academic, the insider critique is really the sense that for a long time, certainly back to the 19th century, people within the sector have worried about what causes get money. So the Charity Organisation Society being this wonderful Victorian organisation that said, no, you're doing it all wrong. Don't give coins to people in the streets. You don't know if they actually need it. Let's get organised. Let's scientifically allocate our money, and you give it all to one central point, and we'll go out and decide who's deserving and who's undeserving. So this is decades ago, over a century ago, and now you have many iterations of that over time: scientific philanthropy, strategic philanthropy, and the current one that's probably better known is the effective altruism movement, which in many ways is a positive thing, getting younger people, certainly in a university campus, getting them fired up and enthusiastic. That's great. But behind it, there's a sense of, we know what to give to and you're giving to the wrong things. And here's some calculation you can use to decide exactly this cause and not that cause. And I just have worries that it makes people feel that they're always going to get it wrong. that they, you know, they were touched by a particular cause. You know, most philanthropy is personal, but it doesn't matter if you were touched by it and you want to somehow pay back for either help you've had or help you wished you'd had. No, we're going to tell you give to this one because you get more bang for your buck. You'll more cheaply save a life by giving to this cause. And I think it's just a bit problematic because it disregards how social change happens in reality. So telling people to pretty much only buy malaria nets rather overlooks the decades of research before into, you know, what causes malaria, how do we, you know, where do mosquitoes,
how do we prevent? Yeah,
exactly. So I worry a bit about the insider critique, that it just leaves people thinking, I better not give because I'll get it wrong. There's a bit of a sort of, you know, and then the populist critique is pretty much what it sounds. You know, populism in all its guises is giving very simple answers to very complex questions. So rather than try to grapple with the complexity and nuance of philanthropy across the world, as we're doing in this conversation and across time, it's easier just to say it's all just a tax dodge. It's all just about ego. And of course, you know, they might sound simple, but they're usually erroneously simple. And again, I think it's very demoralizing for donors who are trying to give and who just get knocked down immediately. It's also beautifully inconsistent. Two of my favorite of the populist, I say favorite, but two of the ones that really blow my mind a bit is the one that's the populist argument that says it does more harm than good. And this is kind of the Anand Giridharadas argument. It does more harm than good. You know, it's just propping up systems. It's a bad thing. Okay, if you hold that view, fine. Another populist argument says they don't give enough. Look, so Bezos gave $1 million to the Australian bushfires. That's nothing. You know, you earned that in 3 seconds. You should give more. Mark Zuckerberg gave 25 million for COVID. It's just a drop in the water. Now, from where I'm standing, if it's a really bad thing that causes more harm than good, why do we want more of it? Why is it also a populist argument to say? So there's just a sense again of like, we're just going to complain and criticize. You can't. Another good example is if you put your name on things, if you attach yourself to things, oh, you're just an ego. But if you do it secretly and quietly, oh, you're being dodgy and, you know, you're trying to have influence behind the scenes. So there's a whole lot of lose-lose in the populist arguments. Whatever you do, you're probably better off just not doing it. And that takes us back to the point of we end up with less philanthropy, which I think causes the harm I mentioned earlier.
Right. And what is, if I may say, what is the right amount to give? You know, what's the right amount? If I have great fortune and I have great fortune, why would I not give? And what does when I say the public, I don't mean just the quote, the populist argument, but rather, you know, what's the right amount to give? How can I give and be generous and feel good and have everybody else feel good about it too?
One of my UK colleagues, Ian McQuillan, came up with the phrase. He said, "Who made us the philanthropy police? Who made us the philanthropy police?" I love that, and that applies to, you know, your cause is wrong, or my cause is better than your cause, and it also applies to you're not giving enough, or you gave too much or you gave by the wrong means. You should give this way and not that way. You know, it's a profoundly personal thing. It's voluntary. You know, you have to pay tax. You're going to want to buy things, but this is a sphere of moral action, and I guess in a way this takes us away from the slightly more jokey things to the serious point that you can't, if something is happens through moral reasons, by saying it's bad and wrong, you kind of take the carpet away from underneath the people who are trying to encourage it, because all they've got is, you know, is that sort of persuasion. They're asking, you know, you'll be a good person for doing this. We'll think well of you. You'll think well of yourself. Your descendants will think well of you. That's what fundraisers have got when they're talking to a big donor. And all of this questioning critique, you know, it's not that we shouldn't question it, but the volume of the noise and the lack of balance in it, I think makes it really hard to continue using the kind of moral arguments, because that reputation has just been undermined so much.
Sure. So it just amplifies one of the dangers of grand critique and lots of noise about philanthropy is really working against the greater good, because while there are some bad actors in any sector, it's discouraging to those in our sector, and it makes it even more difficult for those of us who encourage philanthropy, those of us meaning staff, board members, executives, consultants. Well,
exactly. And just on that, I mean, it's the consequences point. You know, we can't throw around words, you know, it's just a tax dodge, and not think, okay, well, will that make someone more or less likely to give their money away then? Because the money exists. You know, people have this money. You can you can have other arguments and discussions about whether it should be taxed more. As I say, in Europe we do, but at the moment people have some money. They can either spend it on themselves, they can keep it in the bank or hand it on to their kids, or they can give it away. Those are the only three things you can do with money. You can spend it, save it, or give it away. All of this noise, I think, is making the give it away option the least attractive. And I think the consequences of that, we just need to be really careful of what we wish for when we criticise philanthropy, because the consequences, often these are coming from quite idealistic positions. So, people who really want good things to happen, but they're just maybe disassociating the good things and the money you need to achieve good things. And that's what I worry about.
Yeah. No, that makes good sense. Again, it's the unintended consequences that could be the real challenge along the way. Well, I have a couple more questions before we turn things over to Bill with the Q&A from our friends that are attending here. So last month we talked with Michael Moody, and I know that you and Michael have authored a book together. We were talking with him and his co-author, Sharna Goldsaker, about the next generation of donors. And what we heard from them is that the next gen want to do what they call impact giving. They want to make an impact. They want to revolutionize giving. They want to do their research, be involved as volunteers, for example, before they get involved as donors, or at least very big donors. And what they're saying is we want to do this in contrast to what our parents and grandparents did by putting our name in big letters on the outside of a museum, of a building on a college campus. We don't need big recognition, nor do we want to go to cocktail parties and wear long gowns. We want the money to go to the better good. We are going to make more impact. We're not going to have any more of this transactional philanthropy. And so even in this is even a critique among philanthropists themselves, those who do have the means and the ability, that what has happened before hasn't been good enough. It's interesting. It looks like maybe a transition in the attitude about philanthropy, but do you think that this self-identified trend, so to speak, that the younger philanthropists are looking to the older generation and say, not that way? Do you think that it is in response to the other critiques that we're hearing, all of this noise at this time, as you defined it, as this time of hypercriticism of philanthropy and philanthropists?
I do. And I think that, I'm sure we'll all be glad if there is more thoughtful philanthropy. And I think one of my concerns is for the critics to be aware that change is happening, that the young philanthropists that Michael and Sharna were studying are not the same as their parents and their grandparents. Philanthropy changes over time. I see a lot of quest for improvement. One of my challenges to the critics has been, look, in the 20 years these arguments have been made, what do you think are some of the best changes that have happened? I see developments in terms of more effective philanthropy, sometimes driven by that insider critique, more ethical philanthropy, concerned to try and rebalance some of the power dynamics, which can be really corrosive. So donors who I interview saying, we don't want to talk about grant makers and grantees. We see ourselves as partners, that we happen to have the money, but they have the skills and the talents and to accomplish the wherewithal. So of course it's a partnership. Our money can't achieve anything. So there's all these different developments that are happening. And I think, what your last guest described is definitely part of that. So that's overall healthy, and I think shows it's a reflective, thoughtful, sector that strives for improvement. Not everybody, maybe not fast enough, but certainly has heard the criticisms and is trying. But I just wonder if we might be going too far, because if no one ever puts their name on a building, or is willing to speak out about their philanthropy or attend any, receptions, how do we bring in the next donors? Because we all know that's part of the, one of the ways that fundraising works. You bring your friends to an event and then they see it and they get involved, and you see somebody's name on a building, they're open for donations, and it's kind of role modeling, and it's, so I really do understand where it's coming from, and it's definitely coming from a good place. But I think it would be good to make sure that the demand side of philanthropy, the fundraisers, can still do their job if we have a group of donors who really reject all of that side of things, and perhaps allow them to enjoy. It's fun being a donor. There is a joy in being a philanthropist, and part of that comes from the relationships that you get from being able to attend events and what have you. And I think we don't want to take the joy out of philanthropy, because it is, at the end of the day, voluntary. And if we want people to stay with it through their whole lives and encourage their friends and their descendants to do it, we need to make sure it's not too sackcloth and ashes.
Right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that reflection on that, because I think that we may be at, as we were talking about a little bit before our conversation on air, we may be at one of those watershed moments where there is a shift coming down the line. Hope so. Fingers crossed. Well, I have one last question, because I do see that our Q&A box is filling up, and it looks like our friends have lots of questions. This seems like it's a hot button topic, all of this. So in my last question, how should we, our organizations, our board members, our executives, development team members, our volunteer fundraisers, how should we prepare to support philanthropy so that those people who benefit from the services that we nonprofit organizations and those of us in the nonprofit sector provide to those who need it most? How do we need to prepare ourselves?
So I'm glad you asked that, because I think this is, again, one of my main goals is to try and make sure that we can articulate and discuss, push back on some of these things. And one of the more depressing things that I've heard over recent times is people within the sector who are trying to do good, who chose this career because they thought they'd make the world a better place, kind of saying, am I in the wrong gig? Am I just making the world worse? Am I causing more harm than good? Because the criticisms of philanthropy implicate us all. That philanthropy is not just the donor, it's the whole ecosystem. So if I, especially our younger staff, maybe our more idealistic staff, have heard all of this, they've been, they're on social media seeing all these criticisms of philanthropy, and then they have to come to work and at a non-profit organisation and interact with philanthropists, I think it's not fair to them to leave them with these worries that somehow they're causing structural harm and what have you. So let's have those conversations. I think we do need to we need to articulate them more, have them, and allow people the space to say, I'm worried about this. So is our donors' money tainted? Is our very existence stopping the government doing more in this area? Or are we just kind of a sticking plaster? So to have those conversations. And I think with our donors, we need to be prepared, not necessarily to defend them personally. I don't think they thank us for that, as I say, but I think to defend the practice of philanthropy. And I that would be, wonderful if we could see more and more people saying, yes, but here's a great example of where, there's been a nice idea that's been funded and it's made the world a better place. There are millions of people alive because of philanthropically funded vaccines. This lovely museum exists, this lovely theatre exists. Just to keep pointing out that we are all the beneficiaries of philanthropies all the time. One of the COVID vaccines we all know came because of Dolly Parton's money going in there, along with many other donors, along with government money. Let's just mention these counter examples when all we ever hear is the same couple of names who are the most obvious examples of egregious philanthropic bad behaviour. Of course, there are going to be those examples. Philanthropy is fallible because humans are fallible. But I think we need to come back with the more positive examples too.
Yeah. Philanthropy is fallible because humans are fallible. I think that's kind of the crux of a lot of this here. And so that's, thank you so much, Beth. Now we're going to move over to some questions from our audience here today, which I'm really excited about. And we've got a number of them. Bill Mulvihill is going to join us for this section, and he's been curating our questions along the way. So Bill, what's the first thing on our audience members' minds today relative to this question?
And we had some great questions to my friend Carlos. So rather than me paraphrase, I'll read the whole question. So he asked, speaking on power, I think we're conflating power here. This is not about power in the state government, but that giving at large amounts does often cause organizations to bend over backwards to do the things that donors want, but also to ensure we continue getting that money from those individuals. This is still power, not just loyal state government one. Isn't this a case where we would be okay letting those donors give to other organizations like grassroots or for social or racial justice organizations?
Thank you, Carlos. Yeah, I mean, that gives me a chance to say something about the recipients, because I think a lot of the criticisms of philanthropy assume that recipients will take any money for anything. And that's not my experience. I began as a practitioner. I was a fundraiser and then as a charity manager. And we worried about mission drift a lot, which is essentially what you're talking about. What if someone gives you a chunk of money and says, go do something that you didn't really want to do, but we'll only give you the money if you do it. And I think that organizations on the whole have got more backbone and more identity of what they're there for than that. And actually the criticism then is of the recipient, not of the donor. We shouldn't take that money. We don't have to. gifts have to be received as well as taken. What a lot of people don't, as well as given, sorry. Carnegie is a great example for this. What a lot of people don't know is that, yes, he funded 2,500 libraries around the world, but 225 communities said no thank you. They didn't want a library, or they had other greater priorities. They wanted to, get the streets going or something, or they didn't like the man himself. They worried about his, his behaviour, his company. So they said no thank you. And you can always say no thank you. You can always say that doesn't fit with our mission. That's not our work. We don't like your ethos or your money. So I think we just need to be a bit more confident about recipients' ability to judge the merits of what's offered to them.
Another question Carlos has is, are we as fundraisers, shouldn't we be speaking or educating our donors about the problems of white donors gaining their wealth and privilege, simply from the notion that we may not get the money anymore? Is this speaking from fear?
So I didn't quite catch all of that, but I think the issue has been beautifully tackled by Edgar Villanueva. I love his book, Decolonizing Wealth, and I think that's triggered a lot of really important conversations about decolonizing philanthropy, knowing the source of the money, and some good decisions within grant makers about saying, if this is where our money came from, should that change where it's going to? So that lovely phrase of money as medicine. Mm-hmm. So I think that's absolutely the case. But, not all wealth comes from extractive capitalism and from exploitative relationships. So I think of people who've made their money. J.K. Rowling, the British author, the inventor of Harry Potter, has made an awful lot of money from that book. There are other people who made their money through music, the Beatles, sports stars, ethical companies like the Body Shop. So money can be made, large sums of money can be made by other means. And I think when we talk about the problems of philanthropy, we need to acknowledge that there are many different sources of money. So Carlos, you're absolutely right. We need to know, that's probably the first step, is to be aware where money comes from. But also be open to the possibility that money hasn't always come from a problematic source. And we still need to decide what to do with it and how to spend it well.
Then he asked, how do we feel about community-centric fundraising? Is this type of fundraising attacking philanthropy?
Carlos, you've got a lot of questions. Community-centric fundraising, I think, is a really important response to donor-centric fundraising. And it was probably one of those pendulums that needed to swing back. Donor-centric fundraising probably feeds into your first question about it all being about the donor. What do they want? And that's not right. It's a partnership. It should be, it should meet the donor's needs, their psychic and their social needs to feel useful and so on. But if it's not doing any good in the real world, actually, that's not a useful thing to do, and it won't fundamentally satisfy the donor because they want to do good in the real world. So I think there's a swing from donor-centric to community-centric, and I think that's probably a very useful rebalancing.
Mm-hmm.
So, Beth, I have a question, and it's about something that's been happening in America over the last 2 years, and that's this Operation Varsity Blues, where a number of well-known, well-off families have tried to buy their children's way into prestigious universities. Mm-hmm. Obviously, bad news rises to the top. What do you think that impact will have over time, both in people giving money away and both as universities changing the way they admit students?
So this is a brilliant example of something that's a really specific US problem and that taints philanthropy around the world. That's not how we do admittance to universities in the UK or in Europe or indeed any other country that I'm aware of. I'm afraid, if you'll forgive me for being giving an honest European view about this, there are things that the US needs to get its house in order about. One of them is the one you just described. The other is having a decent healthcare system so that if you're ill, you get help, not just because you've got money. That your public schools are funded properly, not just because you live in a rich area, so you have more funding for your schools. From where we're sitting in Europe, a lot of these issues look to us like government failure or regulation failure, rather than philanthropic failure, but that's how they get depicted. So at my university, if a parent or a parent of an existing student or a student who's applying wishes to make a donation, the conversation is usually had with them, let's delay that for 3 years. Let's wait till they've graduated so that there can be no question of their mark being influenced by the fact that there's something new on campus. And that to us is ethical fundraising. So it's difficult for those on the outside to say, yeah, obviously that's caused a problem, don't do it that way.
Right. One of the last question I would have is, I'm a big believer in that none of us, even the most wealthy, have enough assets to do everything they want to do. and they need to leverage with other people or entities, et cetera. People leveraging donations to a university, to a nonprofit fighting a disease. Do you think that's going to continue to grow in the future as people look at how we collaborate in our philanthropy? Or are we going to go down a road where it's, I'm going to do what I want to do and hope other people see that?
Thank you, Bill. I'm glad you asked that, because I think collaboration is actually the really kind of hidden leitmotif of philanthropy, that you can't really achieve anything without collaboration. I mean, the biggest funder in the world, the Gates Foundation, over the last 20 years has done pretty much all its funding in collaboration with the World Health Organization and with other bodies. So if they can't do it without needing other bodies, then none of us can. No donor is an island. And at the very least, you're collaborating with your grantees. So there's always a partner. There is no such thing as a self-sufficient philanthropist. So I think it would be, again, part of the move to improve philanthropy, perhaps to have more recognition of that. You can move further and faster if you work with others who share with you. And it probably makes philanthropy more enjoyable to have partners on the journey.
Right. Well, Carlos has one last question I'll ask is, what if a donor needs, particularly one with larger sums of money, conflict with other donor needs?
Carlos, can I just say I'm grateful to you for your questions. It wasn't a criticism. It's very nice of you to keep us going. Yeah, I mean, donors' needs will conflict. I mean, again, having worked within charities, it does happen that people say, I mean, I worked in a Catholic homelessness charity at the beginning, and some would feel that it was more important we attended to save the spiritual life of the young people we supported. Others would say, no, we need to focus more on the practical skills. It's a live debate, and this goes back to philanthropy being a contested, complex thing. To Liz's last question about what can we do, perhaps we need to get donors talking to each other more, because I think it comes from a good place. They've really got an idea. I know if I give this money, we can make this thing happen. And actually, through conversation, through meeting the recipients, meeting the staff, meeting fellow donors, we can say, oh, maybe a bit of my idea would work with a bit of that other donor's idea, and together we can come up with the right plan. So I think it would be unusual for someone to wish to push something through once they heard that actually it wasn't the perfect plan to begin with and it could be improved. What idea can't be improved? And if they're self-made and they've made money in business, that won't be an unusual process for them. And that an idea isn't perfectly formed from the start, and then it gets better through conversation and through piloting and through measuring, and that's what monitoring and evaluation is all about. So that scenario shouldn't arise.
Well, thank you very much, Beth, for your wisdom and your insights.
Absolutely. And I think before we wrap, thanks, Bill. Thank you for coming to us with some questions of your own and monitoring and curating our questions here. And thank you to everyone who asked Carlos, most specifically, Carlos, you're the star of the day. And I'd like to say, I guess what I'm hearing here from you, Beth, is it's a challenging conversation. It's a nuanced conversation. And the way to come up with the solutions might be something revolutionary, like simply sitting down and having conversations with our donors and encouraging our donors to also talk with one another so that we can mutually come up with, if this is the problem, how can we mutually come up with a solution? And, oh yeah, thank you all for your great idea, donors, and how can you help us leverage your influence, your affluence to make this solution a reality for us? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. But I also don't want to pretend that's a new idea on my part. I think that those conversations are being facilitated. I mean, even at the top level, the giving pledge, top in terms of monetary amounts. Sure. Part of being a giving pledge signatory is that you get invited to to annual gatherings where you can share best practice and brainstorm around an idea of how can we best tackle whatever a group of the giving pledges are interested in. So I think it's maybe as much about us being a little bit more aware, giving a bit more credit for the fact that these conversations are happening, as well as saying, well, let's have more of them. Right. There are so many books, conferences, commissions, pieces of research, new advisory groups. There are so many initiatives out there trying to improve philanthropy that, for a start, that tells us we know philanthropy is not perfect. You wouldn't need all these commissions and efforts if it was already fine. So we can all agree that, but we can also encourage that. And I don't think you encourage people by only criticizing them. I think there is no other area of life where we think, oh, I know, people will do more of that more enthusiastically if we tell them that they're idiots and they're idiots and that they're doing it themselves. You know, it's just not how it works. You know,
Right.
Everything we know from psychology and from behavioral economics says that you work with people who say, good for you for having that little jog. Now let's see if we can jog further, or, you know, well done for switching the light off. Now here's how we can get even more environmentally conscious. You know, so why do we just ignore that in philanthropy and think somehow people are going to give more and give better if we just beat them up all the time? It doesn't make any sense. So that's, you know, that's again, I suppose, the point I want to make, that we're not getting the outcome we want, unless the outcome we want is no more philanthropy. Right. And, you know, nobody's explicitly saying let's end philanthropy, but perhaps again, that's sort of if you delegitimize it enough, if you criticize it enough, you make it less and less appealing. And I'm not so worried about people who are already giving. I think if you're already giving, you understand how it works, you know that you're collaborating, you know you're thinking, you know you're trying to improve. It's the people who haven't yet made their wealth, the people who haven't yet inherited or haven't got the big divorce settlement, and who all they know about philanthropy is the negative stuff they've heard in the public sphere. Why would those people think, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to become one of those people who just gets, you know, knocked and gets it all wrong and is causing more harm than good. That's the concern. And of course, it's a hypothetical concern. We'll never know who might have set up a foundation, but instead they went and bought a private yacht and jet, because no one knocks you if you buy a private yacht and jet. There's no big list of those people. And, you know, there's not whole, you know, efforts to criticize them. It's just very curious that the people who are trying and sometimes failing, but at least trying to do good, get more criticism than those who don't try at all.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I appreciate your thoughts today and the great research that you've done. So in just a quick recap of the day, Beth and dear visitors in our webcast today, we've learned about how journalists and academics alike, and even some philanthropists, have lampooned and criticized philanthropy and big donors for their charitable activities, which are often characterized as a means of self-aggrandizement or tax evasion. And yet still, it's widely acknowledged, and we've talked about a number of those examples here today, from the establishment of the Carnegie Libraries to the Gates Foundation with their global health initiatives, that philanthropy has truly played a critical role in both developed and developing societies. Beth, thank you so much for tackling these main critiques that are leveled at philanthropy and the questions for the rationale for undermining and disparaging philanthropic acts. And I also really want to say we appreciate, I think our whole sector should stand up and applaud. Thank you for having prepared us for more thoughtful conversations about philanthropy so that it may be celebrated, so that it may be championed, and an abundance of causes and interests can flourish. Guests here on our webcast today, thank you for coming and for your insightful questions. We hope you've enjoyed yourself and feel enthusiastic about how philanthropy makes a difference as a change maker where others cannot or will not help, how it's visionary. But while the conversation is not unproblematic, we must remember the greater good that is accomplished by most generously genuine acts. I hope this will help you and your organization promote generosity among your ranks and provide nuanced insights as to how to respond when faced with critical words about philanthropy. So on a final note, I hope you all will join us for our next On Giving, which is Tuesday, November 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Tyrone McKinley-Freeman. Dr. Freeman is also an accomplished professor, speaker, and writer. He's an award-winning scholar and teacher who serves as associate professor of philanthropic studies at Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And his research focuses on the history of African American philanthropy in communities of color, the history of American philanthropy, and philanthropy and fundraising in higher education. And we'll be talking about all of those topics, but really centering around his recent book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow. It's an examination of African American history, charitable giving, activism, and the like, through the example of Madam C.J. Walker. I hope you'll join us for that next session. Again, Beth, we can't thank you enough. This has been great. Your work pulls back the curtain for us on a topic that raises much conversation and controversy. Thank you so much. And those of you who came to visit with us today, if you'd like to learn more about Beth's work and the book is called In Defense of Philanthropy. We'll be sending up a follow-up note to everyone with a link to find where you can get it. And before I go, I would like to thank everyone who made today's program possible. You, guests, Beth Breeze, Beth's publisher from Agenda Publishing, Vicki Capsteck, for providing us with an e-advance copy of her book, and our Skystone Partners colleagues, Bill Mulvihill, our question moderator, and senior consultant Aaron Simon, and executive assistant and office manager Sam Martin for their technical support today. See you at the next On Giving on Tuesday, November 9th. Go forth, do good work. Philanthropy is a powerful force for good.